Bonjour and welcome back to the history of the United States since 1877. Last time we covered the Vietnam War. Today we will still be in the 1970s, but taking a more general look at that decade, which was a traumatic one for the United States, where many problems seem to be piling up at once, whether they're cultural, economic, foreign policy related, and then there's a major political crisis at the same time. The first item on the agenda, culture, in a way, is directly related to the 1960s, where you have a large young population that comes of age, the baby boom. It tends to be quite left-wing in its politics and embraces the counterculture. There are many aspects to that. It might be rock and roll, going to do rock in the northern part of New York State, growing your hair, trying drugs, wearing the peace symbol, living in a commune, all which would be quite exciting if you are, a young straight man who's about to go to Vietnam, and then you become a part of a hippie commune in New York. That's the theme of the musical here. But look at it from a perspective of an older, straighter American, it seems like the whole society is coming to shreds. These are just some long-haired hippies who don't know what to do with their life except for LSD. And that is in a way related to the larger consumption of drugs, which itself is related to Vietnam. Many American GIs, when they went to Vietnam, found themselves in Southeast Asia, a place that is known for the production of poppies, which then go into opium, which then goes into heroin. And so they become hooked not just on the light stuff like marijuana, but also some of the more hardcore stuff like heroin. And then when they come back to the US in the 1970s, they bring with them the drug culture itself. Also part of the way for them to cope with some of the horrors that they had been a part of in the Vietnam War. PTSD, we would call that nowadays. The 1970s is a time when Nixon, in response to that, launched the war on drugs, which, as you know, has been going on for 40 years and hasn't exactly been a great success. So that's one point of crisis. Another major development of the era would be the Roe v. Wade decision by the Supreme Court that legalized abortion up until 12 weeks of pregnancy. And depending on where you come from, you might look at that as a great victory of the feminist movement, or some kind of abomination where hundreds of thousands of babies are going to be killed every year, and the government is okay with that. These altogether became the kind of flashpoints that we talk about when we speak of a culture war. All these hot button issues that people will have very strong opinions about and that tend to divide American society down in half. So it's a very divided period. The same would be true of the sexual revolution, another legacy from the 1960s, which in a way you could see as a celebration of people discovering their body, having access to contraception, or as kind of an abomination where an American society is again going down the drain. The 1970s is when the porn industry becomes more legalized. There were some rules before that in the courts on trying to get smut out of the public. Many of these decisions are struck down in the 1970s as a matter of free speech. So the porn industry really came out into the open as a result. And you have the era what was called porno chic, where the porn industry tried to make actual movies with a plot and with real actors, and then more mainstream people would go and see them. Famously, Jackie Kennedy, the widow of John F. Kennedy, was seen in Times Square going to see Deep Throat, which was the big hit of the period. As the title indicates, this has something to do with athletic fellatio. Watch it if you want. It's easy to get a copy of it. Just be forewarned, it is a hardcore porn movie. Again, you can look at it in two ways. It's either as a matter of sexual revolution or maybe more of a kind of exploitation of women, because the main actress in that movie, Linda Lovelace, later revealed that she had been kind of raped as part of that movie. So is it liberating for her? Is it exploitative? Your call there. Another movie that has far less nudity, just a bit of it, more modern movie would be called Boogie Nights, and it's a really great movie. In part because it really retraces a period in the 1970s and 80s when the porn industry took off and all that came with it, both good and bad. And also happened to be a very good movie from a cinematic perspective. You have Mark Wahlberg, John C. Reilly, Julianne Moore, William Macy, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Don Cheadle, Burt Reynolds. So a great movie to watch if you're interested in that period. Looking at it from a more negative perspective, this is also the period where Times Square in New York City becomes a kind of adult-only zone where you have peep shows, porn theaters, and for many people to be in the middle of a big city and all you have is that louche kind of environment, that seems to be the decline of the big city and a direct consequence of the sexual revolution. So the cultural wars. On an economic level, the situation is definitely not good, which in many ways might be related to the Great Society program of the 60s. Remember that Lyndon Johnson had tried to do both guns and butter, expensive domestic programs and the war in Vietnam. He launched things like Medicare and Medicaid, which are big ticket items. At the same time, he pursued the race to go to the moon, and at that point NASA had a huge budget, so it's a significant portion of the GDP. And then, while doing all that, he expanded the war in Vietnam, and war is super expensive. So he was warned by his economists that you can't spend that much money. To try to balance the budget, he also raised taxes. And generally, when the government tends to spend a lot of money in the economy, an economy that is already doing quite well economically, you have inflationary tendencies. Too much money chasing too few goods, and the prices have a tendency to rise. And you definitely get that by the 1970s, high inflation. The budget will also tend to go higher. That means that the government and the private sector will be competing for borrowing money, and so the interest rates will rise as well. Compounding that problem, by the 1970s, you have external shocks. Specifically in 1973, you have a major war between Israel and its neighbors called the Yom Kippur War, and that led the Arab neighbors to double the price of oil. And then in 1979, you have a revolution in Iran where an ally of the US, the Shah of Iran, is overthrown and replaced by a very anti-American Muslim fundamentalist regime, that of the Ayatollahs. And so that led to a further doubling of oil. So in 10 years, you have a quadrupling of the price of oil. And so for the United States, which used to be seen as the land of plenty, where oil was not something that you try to save except in wartime, all of a sudden, the price becomes quite expensive, over $1 a gallon, which back then is serious money. And even at that price, you might not get it because you actually have oil shortages. So it was seen as a decline of the US, that now the US was reliant on imports from countries in the Middle East that might or might not be friendly to the US. So the end of the American dream, the land of plenty. And because American manufacturers had focused on producing those huge aircraft carriers of the 70s, the market then shifted to smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, and that led to a crisis in the auto industry by the 80s because people started buying Japanese cars instead of those huge American cars. So that's another consequence there. Normally, economists argue that you either have inflation or a recession, meaning when the economy is booming too hard, then the prices have a tendency to go up, and that's called inflation. On the other hand, if the economy is underpowered, and that's where you have recession and unemployment, then there will be a low demand for goods, and the prices will go down, or even you will have negative inflation, deflation, which was the case in the Great Depression. Well, in the 70s, you have a weird situation where generally the GDP doesn't grow that much, and you have serious recession on several occasions. So the employment tends to be fairly high, and typically around 4 or 5% would be considered full employment in the US. So anything above that means people have a hard time finding jobs. And then at the same time, still you have high inflation. Normally you shoot for an inflation rate of 2 to 3% in an economy. And in about the late 1970s, you're more around the neighborhood of 10%, part of it being related to the oil crisis. So you have the worst of both worlds. High inflation and at the same time sputtering economy and high unemployment. So economists had to create a new term for that, and they call that stagflation, stagnation mixed with inflation. On the international scene, things were not looking that good either. The last lecture was about the war in Vietnam, and that's, by many standards, the first time that the United States had been defeated in combat. Making things worse, that defeat had not been a glorious one because the United States had employed methods that amounted to war crimes, or at least the deaths of millions of civilians, and you have massacres like at My Lai. So in 1973, when the United States signed the Treaty of Paris, there was a realization that the United States might not be the military colossus that it seemed to be, especially defeated by a small nation of rice farmers, basically. And things got even worse by 1975, when Saigon fell, South Vietnam ceased to exist altogether. And you have all these striking scenes of people trying to escape from the US embassy in Saigon. So a sense of defeat. At the same time, the Soviets seem to be on the up and up. Of course, now we know that they eventually lost the Cold War, but in the 70s it was not clear at all. They were active throughout the Third World, especially in Afghanistan, which they invaded in 1979, as I recall. Eventually, that war in the 80s turned out to be a quagmire for them, but it was not clear as of 79, and was seen as a violation of the doctrine of containment. Remember that during the Cold War, the goal of the United States was to prevent any more country from going communist. Well, here's one. At the same time, some communist government also took office in Nicaragua, which would be much closer to the United States. So yet another failure of containment right there. And then, as I mentioned, in 1979, the Shah of Iran was overthrown. The Ayatollahs took office. They were not a communist regime, but they were violently anti-American. And among other things, they captured diplomats that were in the U.S. embassy in Tehran. The U.S. tried to rescue them in a daring special forces operation, except that one went flat and the helicopters were lost in the desert. And so for over a year, American diplomats were held hostage. So the Soviets seemed to be on the way up, and America, in the wake of the war in Vietnam, seemed in a great period of doubt. So when you have a situation like that, you really want to have strong political leadership to get you out of your funk. And in that regard as well, the political situation was subpar. Part of it is connected to the after effect of the 1960s, which was a rather liberal decade, not just moderate liberalism like that of Lyndon Johnson, where you want to create some programs for better healthcare or education to help people help themselves. But I'm talking also more radical politics derived from the anti-Vietnam War movements, and sometimes going all the way to the use of violence to achieve goals. When we talked about civil rights movement, we mentioned that by the late 60s, early 70s, some civil rights movement have shifted away from an integrationist, non-violent approach to something more radical, that of the Black Panthers. Technically, they were all about self-defense, but for many mainstream white Americans, to see a large group of black men with guns in a compound in a big city seemed like it was the beginning of a civil war, especially when they end up in a shootout with the police. You also have more white groups that are also involved in political extremism, such as the Weather Underground, which is kind of a leftist group that saw itself as at war with the fascist right-wing government of the United States. And they got to the point where you have bombings in the US. So to many Americans, it looked like, well, we're in a quasi-situation of civil war. One event that really drove home the point took place in 1970 in Kent, Ohio, where you have a university, Kent State, and it was still during the Vietnam War, so you had a major demonstration by students against Vietnam, and that's a peaceful demonstration. But the National Guard was brought in, and it's like a war zone. They brought in with guns that are loaded and bayonets, and they marched against the students, and eventually they start shooting into the students, and 4 students were shot. And this really shocked at least middle America, thinking now we have war zones that are not just in Vietnam on the other side of the world, but right there in Ohio on a campus where young kids, students, are being shot by essentially other young kids in the National Guards. Where are we going with that? Beyond that politically inspired violence, you also have everyday violence. In the 1960s, you have a rise in the crime rate in the United States. The causes are difficult to penetrate. Some of it might be connected to the drug violence around the same time. And you also have a sense of despair in many big cities as the promises of the civil rights movement led to legal equality, but not necessarily income inequality between blacks and whites. So you have several outbreaks of violence as riots, whether it's in Newark, New Jersey, or Detroit, Michigan, or Watts in Los Angeles in California. And so it seems like the country is falling apart when you see those images on the TV of businesses burning and people in the street fighting with the police. A notorious case took place in 1977 in New York City, where there was a big electrical blackout. Initially, people were excited about that. It's kind of a fun night where you're going to eat or drink by candlelight. But as the night progressed, people figured that's the time to commit crimes, and you have a wave of riots in various parts of the city. Arson, and that's the way you get your light in the middle of the blackout, burning businesses and such, and people start looting electronic stores and the like. So it looks like a major city in the United States. New York City was not only dysfunctional because you can't even run electricity, but also the minute that the electricity is turned off, this is such a pressure cooker that the whole city will explode in flames. And you see that if you like to watch cop shows in the 1980s, many of them, like Law and Order and such, are set up in New York City with a strong sense that the city had been plagued by high rates of violence and murders, and you go jogging through Central Park and you might be raped. So it's a difficult time in that sense, and those photos of Times Square are definitely driving home the point. Oh, and by the way, New York City went bankrupt too, and the federal government refused to bail them out. So who is going to fix all that then if you have a profound cultural, economic, international, and political crisis that is driving the country into two halves? Well, the first president of the 1970s would be our old friend Richard Nixon, whom we already encountered as a hardcore anti-communist in California in the late 40s, then as a vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s, then as a contender for president in the 1960 election against John F. Kennedy, an election that he lost narrowly, then was pretty miffed about it and went into a self-imposed exile for much of the decade, but came back in a big way in 1968 when he was elected president, and then reelected in 1972. There are a lot of things to say about Nixon, some good, some bad. We forget the good things. He was actually fairly moderate in his internal politics. The Republican Party back then was far more moderate than today. Among other things, he created the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, because in the 1970s, that's the birth of the environmental movement. You have some events, again in Ohio, where the Cuyahoga River, which runs through Cleveland, actually caught on fire because it was so polluted that there were paint thinner in the waters and such, and actually burnt on several occasions. That's another sign that maybe our cities are just going down the drain altogether. So despite the sense of despair that is connected to it, it led to important laws on clean water and clean air and the creation of the EPA under Richard Nixon. On the bad side, well, he happens to be a crook. And this became clear where there was a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, which is just a set of hotels by the Potomac River just north of the mall in Washington, D.C. And this initially was just some failed burglary that didn't seem that important, but two young journalists from the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, investigated that and realized that the burglars were kind of connected to security agencies in the U.S., and seemed to be far more important than just run-of-the-mill burglars. And by unwinding the whole story, they realized that they were actually acting on behalf of the Republican Party, and the place that they had been burglarizing was the Democratic Party headquarters. It was during the 72 campaigns, so they were just trying to obtain internal documents from the Democratic Party to use in the campaign. And this was not enough to derail the re-election of Nixon in 72. In fact, he won in a landslide. But as more and more evidence came out by 73, it became quite clear that this had been ordered all the way from the top, from the White House itself. And as it happened, Nixon was taping all of his conversations. So there was a big fight on trying to get the tapes, which he refused to do. And then finally, the courts ordered him to do that. And when the tapes were played, it was revealed that he was not that nice a person in private. There's a lot of homophobic, racist, anti-Semitic slurs in there. And it turned out that the Watergate burglary was just the tip of the iceberg. There were a lot of campaign finance violations, abuse of the IRS, abuse of the FBI, and on and on and on. So much so that there was talk of impeaching him in Congress, and you remember the procedure. You start in the House of Representatives that will indict the president, a bit like a grand jury would, and then the matter goes to the Senate, which will act as a kind of a jury or a judge that will examine the evidence and decide by a qualified majority whether to remove the president from office at all. It seemed to be going in that direction. So far, there had only been one case of impeachment against President Johnson, the other Johnson, back after the Civil War, and that procedure had failed back then. But in the 1970s, under Nixon, it looked like he was going to succeed. And so rather than being impeached altogether, Nixon decided to resign of his own. How many people have we encountered who resigned from the White House so far in this class? None. This was the first time that this had ever happened in American history. So quite unprecedented at a sign of crisis. Who becomes president when the president resigns? Well, as always, the vice president. But the person who had been elected in 1972, Spiro Agnew, was also a crook and had also resigned for other issues. So as a result, the House of Representatives had nominated a new person to replace the vice president, and his name was Gerald Ford. And when Nixon in turn resigned, well, there you have Gerald Ford in the White House, even though he had never been elected. and he tried to be re-elected in 1976, and he failed, so that makes him the one president in US history that was never actually elected. Beyond that, the press was quite merciless with him. He's not a bad person, but there were several occasions where he fell in public, and that might be just going down the steps from Air Force One, and these are metallic steps, and it's slippery because it's been wet, and he falls down the steps. I mean, that could happen to everybody, including me. But when you're president of the United States, and the presidency is like a 24-hour fishbowl where everybody is always spotting whatever you're doing, people think of you as a fool. The joke was that this was a man who could not chew his gum and think at the same time. And you can read more of a symbol of how the United States was declining during that period if the president can't even be standing up when he arrives on the tarmac in a foreign country. So he ended up being a one-term president, or even less than that, a half-a-term president, and he was replaced in 76 by a Democratic candidate because of the widespread dissatisfaction with the Republican Party in the aftermath of Watergate. In the Nixon-Ford administrations, now you have a shift back to the Democrats. That president was James Earl Carr, better known as Jimmy, who came from Plain, Georgia. Again, a good person. He teaches Sunday school. He had been a peanut farmer. Also a smart person. He had been in charge of a nuclear submarine, at least the engineering part of it. And also really a good man. He later won the Nobel Peace Prize. And since retirement, he also ran Habitat for Humanity, among other things. But when he was president, he was not as liked. People might respect him, but just they would not think that he was cut for the job. For one thing, he faced a lot of problems. Many of the things that I mentioned, whether it's the second oil shock, or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or the Iran hostage crisis, or the very high inflation, all that happens in the late 70s, early 80s, right when he was president. And so there was a sense that he might be a great guy, but he did not have quite the shoulders for the job. And that became quite evident in a speech that for some reason that I don't know about is known as the Malaise speech. And I don't complain about it, it's a French word, it means uneasiness or queasiness. I just found it surprising since the word never appeared in the speech itself. It was a speech that was about the energy crisis, and he started by explaining, well, the problems that I just identified, and the fact that the country was really not sure about itself, and pretty much the whole lecture that I just did condensed. And then at that point, people were saying, yes, okay, it's a good analysis of the situation. What comes up next? What is the solution that you're offering? And there the speech stopped. He was good at understanding the problem, but did not offer the kind of a shot in the arm to make people believe that there was light at the end of the tunnel. And remember some of the more famous lines from the presidents that we have studied before. Somebody like Franklin D. Roosevelt in his 33 presidential inauguration said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself, optimism." Or when we talked about John F. Kennedy, the famous line from his inaugural speech was, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." So it's a sense of optimism that has always been connected with the American experience, and that seemed to be missing from Carter. Also, in order to lead by example during the energy crisis, he decided that the White House would be set at a lower temperature in the winter, and he would just be wearing a sweater, and so he would address the American people wearing that sweater. But people thought it's really a decline of the United States when the president can't even pay his electricity bills and had to be shivering in the White House. So if you're interested in that decade, there are some movies that you can watch. I mentioned Hair before, Deep Throat, Boogie Nights. Add to the list the movie All the President's Men, which is about the investigation into the Watergate scandal. And also a classic is a movie Network, which, as the title indicates, is about a TV station during the period, but it's really about the sense of unhappiness that people have in the late 70s. And the key character in there at some point just burst out, "I'm mad as hell, and I can't take it anymore." And that seemed to sum up the mood of the American people by that point. So I don't want to give a sense that everything in the 1970s is bad. You've got the death of a Chinese dictator, and the birth of a history professor, and the village people, and I guess that's about it. So maybe we should get ready for the 80s. Well, the 80s will come next time, and that's where we're going to see if the political crisis solves itself, and especially if you have a president that tends to be more sunny and optimistic and gives a sense to Americans that they will be a light at the end of the tunnel. And let's see if the Soviets eventually lose the Cold War. But that will be the topic for the next lecture. In the meantime, au revoir, and see you next time.